In 2006, the Institute of Medicine again tasked, this time by PA, not by Congress, to do a summary of all of the body of knowledge that had been accumulated up until that time. And in discussing this Department of Defense study, the wording of the report says that the Department of Defense published a report documenting a large amount of pesticide use, but it's difficult or impossible to reconstruct doses because of the lack of exposure measurement, and that the situation is compounded by the stress experienced by many veterans during deployment and in some cases after deployment. Stress is known to have serious chronic health effects, etc. Well, this was 2006. There was a lot known about stress and Gulf War illness at that time. In 2004, in fact, the Department of Veterans Affairs and further research based on the premise that stress was the cause of these illnesses. So, the Institute of Medicine report in this case was being quite stringent in terms of saying, well, we don't have dose data, so we can't consider this pesticide information. On the other hand, it was quite open and willing to consider stress, even though that had been ruled out by the PA itself. The bottom line of that report was this book, that there is not a unique symptom complex or syndrome with deployed Gulf War veterans. That is what was emphasized in the press release and in the press conference held as a release of that report. And this is the kind of media that resulted from that. That quote, that there is no Gulf War syndrome, headlined every VA publication for the next 4 years. Every congressional testimony, every scientific report of scientists, and every report of veterans itself. Then we come to 2010. The sky opens. And once again, the Institute of Medicine is looking at all of the data and doing an excellent job. And you've had this quoted by several people now, so I won't re-quote it. But what I will add, which is from Dr. Stephen Hauser, who was the chairman of that IOM committee. Many of you may know he's the chairman of neurology at the University of California, San Francisco. He said, to speed the development of effective treatment, cures, and prevention, the committee suggests a path forward, and we believe rigorous science begins with answers and likely now. That's the reason I am still working. We are all close to this, obviously. These veterans are close to this issue, but an Institute of Medicine committee of distinguished people who were not close to it came up with this kind of challenge to science and verification that this was a scientific problem that was real and was worth working on. Since that report, we have seen a wide range of researchers entering this field who never were interested in it before. We have seen Congress appropriate additional money that it never was interested in providing before. And results are starting to come out as a result of this report. So I respect the power of the Institute of Medicine, and I respect what it can do when it's doing its job well. And we thought we were there. We thought this issue's on a glide path now. Science is going to solve this. Why we're all concerned here is that the report this year from the three treatment committee, here are just a couple of quotes that will give you a sense. Clinicians should approach chronic multiple syndrome with a person-centered model of care that helps patients understand that the word psychosomatic is not the word. also hear from a VA that is still mired in some of the issues we've heard of here today. There's Coughlin testifying. There's Dr. Rossoff. Dr. Bernard Rossoff was the chairman of the previous Iowa committee, and he was being asked why his committee invited predominantly speakers whose background in multiple illness was from the 1990s that besides psychiatric nature of these illnesses just 1 year ago. Here's the New York Times story of about 2 weeks ago on Gulf War illness. This was last week. As Mr. Hardy mentioned, he and the other Gulf War veterans on the panel, my committee walked out to protest the fact that VA is changing our charter to eliminate our independence. That article contains the fact that the Senate staff members said the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee considered holding a hearing to investigate this. And this is the last one I'll mention. Give you a sense for the last days. Critics concerned over VA sweeping changes to Gulf War panel. Representative Mike Hoffman, chair of the House Veterans Affairs Committee on the Focus investigation, and a Gulf War veteran, skeptical of the change. I think that there's just a history of well-founded distrust by Gulf War veterans of the actions of VA addressing this issue. So you can see this issue is as toxic today as battlefield with the veterans model. It is the traditional mission of the institute to resolve such matters, to provide unbiased and authoritative advice to decision makers. You've seen examples in my short review here of where the Institute of Medicine has fulfilled that role admirably, and also where I would say it's fallen short. So I wish you success in your adventure. I appreciate very much your hands on, and I'm confident that the outcome is going to be a reflection of the best.
Well, thank you, and thank you all for your comments, which are extremely informative, both of the content and also your positions. I would emphasize that Institute of Medicine committees, similar to ours, are regularly charged with looking at what the evidence is at the time for a set of issues. The evidence changes. There's been substantial progress, as I think Dr. Steele, Dr. White, Dr. O'Callaghan have demonstrated, to both our knowledge of issues related to this illness and toxicology, the relationship between the central nervous system and the other organs of the body, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that a committee can only be held to the level of the charge that they are given. Certainly the IOM has accepted it, the level of evidence. Members of this committee have served on previous IOM panels, and they have already acknowledged that the world has changed significantly since they looked at those issues. I was intimately involved in the Agent Orange activities for a whole variety of reasons, and that has also matured dramatically as the evidence came in. So we have to be evidence-driven, and there are always debates as to what constitutes the evidence, how good the studies are, how the opinions of other organizations, whether the Department of Defense or anybody else, how good those opinions are. That's a judgment call by people trying to apply that judgment in a conscientious way. And this committee is certainly not going to spend a lot of its time reassessing previous reports. We've got enough on our plate to move on to what we have to do. I am going to comments on the urgency of developing a consensus statement definition of adult multi-symptom illness. I believe that section is what's. If you look at the third bullet, I'm quoting from the last sentence, quote, well, I'll go earlier than that. The whole bullet, the success of establishing a consensus statement definition relies to a large extent on the skills and expertise of the case definition expert panel. The lack of a consensus case definition 20 years after the Gulf War reflects historic complexity and competing views related to chronic multi-symptom illness in Gulf War veterans. The consensus panel should be constituted so as to ensure that it A, includes members with the specific skills and scientific expertise required to accomplish the task. It doesn't say they have to have those skills in relation to work they did in the Gulf War. It says they have skills and scientific expertise, and that it includes sufficient, in a quote, independent experts, end quote, to avoid impedance of the task by entrenched interests, end quote. My only point is that I fully respect the capacity of investigators in the field, people who treat patients, and so forth, to work hard to come up with a consensus position, and certainly would not want to exclude any such activity. However, as I read this section of the report, the VA, in asking the Institute of Medicine to take this on, is reflecting those recommendations. And the committee indeed includes experts on disorders, on gastroenterologic disorders. Some of them have been involved in issues related to policy in the war. Many of them have analytic skills as to looking at symptoms, which is why some of them have worked in chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, et cetera, not because of any bias about those syndromes, but because their expertise is relevant to the activity. Well, I guess I have to ask you, in your very clear indictment to this committee for not being made up of people who work in the field, why this does not reflect the goal of this strategic plan in some meaningful way.
I understand what you're saying, and I concur with the notion of having people participate in the case definition effort who don't have any kind of axe to grind or any kind of preference for any specific approach or anything like that. I think having panel members such as yourself is extremely helpful in that regard. At the same time, I think that the larger body of people who should be involved in developing an expert consensus case definition should be people with expertise in Gulf War illness. And I'll just two comments relative to what the strategic plan says. The strategic plan was developed with, as I said, working group. The working group for case definition actually specifically outlined the types of expertise needed for Gulf War illness expert consensus panel. That was modified by VA edit, and or anyone else was involved in the process. And so while our committee and other committees have generally supported the strategic plan, as Mr. Hardy indicated earlier, that the committee did not support some of these modifications, such as the ones that sort of watered down some of the specific targeted recommendations for how to develop a case definition. So there's that aspect that the working group that worked on this for many months has said specifically, we want independent panelists. We also think it's important to have buy-in and participation of people who know the responses, people that know the now what it means to try to identify this patient group, and who have done it over the years with different patient groups. I mean, there, as you know, quite a few people. The two consortia alone have, 10 to 15 Gulf War illness experts. There's a lot of people to draw from. That aside, just zooming the lens learned that a little bit from the specific wording of the current version of the strategic plan. Just thinking about it in general, when you think about how any condition has ever been defined anywhere, do you have any examples where people who were not expert in the field were predominantly responsible for defining a condition?
Well, I don't want to get into a big debate because I want my colleagues to ask questions, but the IOM has experience with situations. I'll give you one example. It's not a definition, but when the CDC asked the IOM to establish a standing committee to look at the problems associated with the side effects of vaccines, which is a very controversial issue, we chose to put no experts who developed vaccines on that committee because almost invariably they were working on vaccines. They wanted to get those vaccines and into public use, or if they had already had any vaccine dealt with by the FDA. The Institute was roundly criticized because it didn't have the experts in vaccines on the committee. The reality is there were very good scientists and physicians who very quickly came up with regard to what the issues were. They issued a series of reports. In that particular case, Congress, who was unhappy with some of them, did an investigation on conflicts of interest and expertise, and the result was a series of very important reports in which the committee had none of the so-called infectious disease community, of course, was very upset because they thought the vaccine people had to be on the committee. There are many examples in science of where you can get outstanding scientists who can review data. Now, with that notwithstanding, I would hope that as we go forward in our work, and we have a relatively short period of time, I mean, we've got to get a lot of our work done by the end of this calendar year. I hope that we can have regular input from the community, that people who have experience and so forth will want to share that, and we will try to be sure that there are opportunities to do that under appropriate circumstances so that we take the advantage of that experience. But again, I don't want to turn this into a defense of the Institute of Medicine, but I do want folks to understand some of the logic behind. Nobody on this committee, including me, had anything to do with negotiating an arrangement with the VA. The last thing I'm going to get into a discussion about who and why the Veterans Administration operates or the role of the RAC or anything. We have a problem. That's a basic definition of this illness, and we're going to stay focused on that and see if we can resolve questions.
If I may just add one point, Dr. Scheid. The quote that you read, just to make sure it's clear for Dr. Steele's answer, is not in the strategic plan that this committee approved. It was added by VA staff in the last 6 months. If you look at Mr. Harding's version, it's not there. That's why that's why I
operate on the assumption or on the basis of data. I don't know about market graphs. Questions from the committee? Please. Something at the end. I can't see who it is.
Yes. Other subtypes. The different prevalence figures that you show. They're not. Right. There's been for any subtypes. Yes. And some of them can be distinguished depending on their exposure history. But in just terms of clinicians, we know that some of the symptom domains affect virtually all sick veterans, but some of them only affect substance. So, for example, the most prominent symptoms are the ones that fall in the neurological and cognitive domain, the fatigue and the pain, the widespread pain. And then subsets have gastrointestinal problems, respiratory problems, and skin disorders. So the subtypes you can find just based on the symptom profile.
Yes.
group that's also a veteran in all the country. You know, there's this 1/3 or so that seems to be affected, 1/4 or 1/3, whatever, and they were subjected to the same environment, but there were different outcomes. And in toxicologic research and environmental and occupational exposure research, that kind of pattern suggests that some people are susceptible to something. One very strong hypothesis about susceptibility relates to genetics. So that could be wrong, but the 2010 IOM committee thought the same thing, and it's just kind of an area that VA is in following. If we can get some biomarkers for genetic susceptibility, the exposures that occurred in the Gulf War to having Gulf War illness, that's one strategic area that VA has talked about, the MRC has talked about. So we will be great if we can actually understand susceptibility or not, and if so, what it is.
Dr. Galam, also from the RAC, do you see evidence in relationship to acetylcholinesterase inhibitors?
Okay.
I wonder if it would be acceptable for me to comment.
Yeah, Deborah.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on the first question, and it seems like there's different groups and they've come up with different case definitions. Have there never been any attempts to integrate across these data sets and to look at the data now? I mean, that's certainly done in other areas of toxicology when these kind of things occur, and it doesn't seem like that's never been done. That would be a great way to work out subgroups as well. Sure, and you could look at
Should apply them throughout the different populations for which we have comparable data, and that we also think that's a great idea, and that's specifically why the strategic plan called for an analytic approach that would do just that.
Yeah, excellent presentations. All four of yours were very eye-opening to me. I know we're charged with coming up with a new case definition. On the other hand, I don't want to reinvent the wheel. I don't want to disregard what has been done with enormous amounts of data already. And I see a lot has been done. So, at least from my individual perspective, data analytic techniques are critical to establishing the validity of a case definition. And if we have enormous amount of data resources available to us that could inform what we're doing, I think we should use those data resources. I guess I'm a little surprised and almost shocked that we can have an accretion of knowledge on Gulf War illness and actually be told that that's part of our charge to address it. I don't understand that. I do get the authority of the IOM to influence health policy, as the case you've made, and so therefore I think this committee is very important. And having independent experts, to me, probably does increase the credibility because we don't come in with an axe to grind. Not that people with expertise are going to on this committee, but I think independent experts probably make the case a little bit better to be free of bias. So anyway, to me this was extremely informative, and I know at least my thinking is this committee is going to be influenced by what you've said, and I hope it's going to lead to something that perhaps is a little bit more substantive and takes into account what has been done. Not just looking at case definitions, but how they've been handled analytically. That to me, if you have that data, don't ignore that data. Thank you again.
That question for Roberta. In terms of, we just talked about symptom domain. Have you looked at clustering of the symptoms? For example, autonomic dissociation, which I think we do see a lot together. And with the clustering, can you then potentially identify
an exposure. What I'm hearing is that there are multiple exposures, and it may be that the symptom complex may be related to different, if you cluster the symptoms together, you may find that there's a different exposure or potentially a multi-hit type of phenomena rather than gene and environment. Has anyone looked into
Yeah, and there's several factors that play there. One is that most of the patients do group together several of the symptoms of some way. So it is a cluster of symptoms of symptoms. On the other hand, in a more analytic sense, there have been cluster analysis in their group and others that have looked at the symptoms cluster together just ambiently, just by doing it analytically. I believe that most people looking at the available data don't think it's just one exposure that causes it, that it's potentially some combination of exposures, different combinations of different people, potentially separate things in different people, potentially different genes. I mean, there's some preliminary data suggesting that the peroxidase gene in combination with exposure is associated with higher rate of illness for certain genotypes. So, yes, we look at groups of these domains together, and then we, in looking at both for illness defined in that way, using different kind of clustering of the symptom domains, then we do the retrospective analysis to see how it might link up to exposures. So far, the leading ones that it links up to when you do the appropriate control for confounding and like that tend to be the neurotoxins that we've all discussed. Does that address your? But are you seeing? I guess questions about types. Are you seeing clustering of types where they're more defined subtypes? We in our group we've looked for clustering of subtypes related to locations where people were deployed. We know that locations associate, for example, with rates of ALS, with rates of brain cancer. For Gulf War illness, there's been very minimal looking at subtypes in association with different exposures. This location. The only example I can think of related
Come on,
to
God damn it.
paper that from the Boston Environmental Hazard Center that I was a part of, where we actually looked at symptom clusters and specific exposures related. So with some of the exposures, I had respiratory involvement, but not others, and they predicted to the kind of exposure that you might talk about. So it was a neurotoxin cluster around nervous system symptoms, and if with oil well fires and respiratory. So there's a paper I can direct you to that does look at that kind of question. That was done really a long time ago before we even knew if there was a condition. But there's a little bit out of it.
Thank you very, very much. We appreciate your care. I'd like to ask the committee, unless there's violent need for a bio break, to stay in place. Let's get our last panel in place. Very late. One of the panelists is on the telephone. That's what you heard. We'll ask our scientific colleagues to come forward. Thank you.
Louder, I can't hear.
Is that you?
Yes.
Yeah, hold on. We're trying to get reorganized. We're running
Okay.
very late.
Sorry.